Tonight's show is brought to you by the new taste of Coca-Cola and by McDonald's restaurants in Western New York and Bradford, Pennsylvania.
Good evening. Tonight, a special look at our very own spectacular site, Niagara Falls, as we celebrate the first 100 years of the Niagara Reservation.
The mighty cataracts draw hundreds of thousands of visitors here each year.
In the next hour, we're going to show you things about the Great Falls that you've probably never seen before, as we salute the people who fought to preserve Niagara for generations. To begin, we go back hundreds of years before many Americans even knew Niagara Falls existed. News Center 2's Roxanne Adrian takes us back in time.
The earliest recorded Niagara Falls residents were Native Americans.
It's difficult to say who lived there originally. Historically, I guess it was probably the neutral or tobacco nations these are people they're no longer recognizable as a distinct group of people any longer.
The Turtle, a Native American museum, restaurant, and learning center, is a falls landmark. The Turtle aims to preserve Native American folklore that so richly influenced Niagara Falls and surrounding areas. In fact, the word Niagara comes from the Indian Oniagara.
What it actually means literally is bottom land bisected. And what that would mean is that the land then is split in two, which is virtually what the Niagara Gorge does.
Perhaps the most popular Niagara Falls Indian legend is that of the Maid of the Mist. It's also the most widely misinterpreted. The tourist version is that of Indian people who annually sacrificed a maiden to please the Thunder Beings, godlike creatures who, according to legend, lived under the falls. Green says that's all wrong and adds that Seneca Chief Corbett Sundown tells the true story.
He's told us a story that he says is passed down within the Seneca people for generation after generation.
As the legend begins, a young Indian maiden is asleep in the woods, and as she sleeps, a serpent enters her body.
I used to do that when I was a kid, lay under the tree and go to sleep. And so when this girl went to sleep, they saw this thing go in her dress.
When the girl came of age, she married, but shortly after the wedding night, her groom mysteriously died. After that, the woman remarried twice, and in each marriage, her husbands again died shortly after the wedding night. The despondent woman then decided to take her life by going over the falls. But as legend goes, the Thunder Beings caught her going over and took her to their cave-like home beneath the falls.
So they went under the falls. She knew that they went under the falls. Mm-hmm. So when she got inside, there was a high ceiling and all these people sitting around.
The woman's tribe knew nothing of this, in part due to the Thunder Beings' supernatural powers.
While they were outside, she couldn't even see them. But once they got inside, they were natural like she was.
The Thunder Being chief told her of the snake that entered her body and was responsible for her husband's death.
So he described the little snake at the beginning was about this long. So when it landed on the floor, he used to speak, good-sized snake.
The Thunder Beings removed the snake and after 4 years returned the woman back to her people. But then they left the cave under the falls. Today, Native Americans proudly preserve their folklore and traditions, but try to dispel damaging falsehoods.
Up to this day, I have had people come and ask me if Indian people still live in teepees. And we have to, try to get all that stereotyping of Indian people out of the minds of the non-Indians.
Niagara County Native Americans still believe the legends passed down year to year, one of which involves the return of the Thunder Beings, who they say will carry with them a message.
There will be a sign that when the world's coming to an end that they will be bringing. At the time that the world will come to an end, the thunder will start in the east, and it'll keep getting louder and louder, and they say that the thunder will be so loud that people's ears will not be able to tolerate the sound.
After the coming of the white man, greedy businessmen moved in, way next to this great natural wonder, determined to charge admission to make money. And the Niagara Falls tourism industry was born. The Native Americans who remain here have learned how to capitalize on their native heritage and on tourism. Now, 100 years after the park at Niagara Falls was created.
Thank you, Roxanne. In a few moments, we'll show you the vast tourist trap around Niagara Falls today, and we'll tell you about the fight back in the 1800s to keep the tourism business at a distance. Back on July 15th, 1885, the festivities in Niagara Falls brought a happy conclusion to a long struggle in making Niagara free. The fight was between defenders of private property and those who championed to preserve the falls as a natural landmark. The victory saved Niagara from the continued threat of industrial and commercial blight. Hamilton Miser is a historian, and he has chronicled the events leading up to this historic day over 100 years ago.
In the 1870s, a number of the people around the country, not in Niagara Falls, but people such as Olmsted and others in New York City and Boston and intellectuals around the world, in fact, were urging that the commercialization of Niagara Falls be halted. An association was formed in New York City known as the Niagara Falls Association. There were no members from Niagara Falls in that group. And after several abortive efforts to introduce legislation to acquire the property, they finally convinced T.V. Welch to become a part of the group, and he had been a member representing Niagara Falls or in the Niagara area in the legislature. In 1883, he did become a very integral part of the effort to free Niagara and contributed substantially to the effort through his contacts with members of the Assembly and others in the legislature. And after a considerable effort around the entire state through newspapers and other agencies, they were able to get enacting legislation through the legislature to buy the land surrounding the park. But it was not until almost the final minute that providing the legislation that Governor Hill finally signed it. Indeed, it was a matter of really of minutes before a deadline that had been set as of 12 noon on a particular day.
Over the last 200 years or so, those eager to make a dollar have been determined to use this scenic wonder to intrigue visitors, especially visitors with money in their pockets. And it's been a fascinating battle for the bucks. News Center 2's Dick Lusinski has witnessed a lot of it, having grown up right here in the Falls.
Fred, the tourist trade has taken two distinct forms here over the years. There are attractions intended for those who happen to come into the area, and then there are the real money makers, those who charge a fee for the best way to look at the waterfall.
There has been no lack of ingenuity. The shenanigans began in the late 1700s, when you could pay to be lowered into the Niagara Gorge in a basket. No room for the faint-hearted here. In the 1820s, you could pay to visit Goat Island. A 25-cent toll would get you the use of Augustus Porter's bridge to the island all year long. 1829, Nicholas Biddle builds a staircase down the face of Goat Island so tourists could creep in the back of the falls to the Cave of the Winds. Not to be outdone, Porter then builds the Terrapin Tower at the brink of the Horseshoe Falls, a daring bit of one-upsmanship. It was 30 feet high, and from its balcony, you could let the falls overwhelm your senses, the power of the cataract sending a chill up and down your spine. Over the years, there have been other ingenious ways developed to give people a thrill. In 1851, a platform had been built to let people crawl out over the waterfall. One wrong move and, well, about that same time, the first mate of the mist boat began taking the curious close to the base of the falls. It's a marvelous trip, and it's still going strong. The latest innovative ways to make money from the sightseers include a ride to the top of the Skylon Tower. For $3 or so, you can go skyward and perch way above it all to see the falls like the birds. Back on the ground, we mentioned the other way people are making money from the falls and tourism. There's an ample variety of carnivals, amusement parks, wax museums, shops, and other things to do. things that will keep a tourist busy for a long time.
Fred, it's hard to pin down exactly how much the tourist trade is worth in this area, but the Niagara Falls Convention and Visitors Bureau estimates it could be worth as much as $45 million a year. Back to you.
Thanks, Dick. In a few moments, we're going to branch out into something that'll raise your blood pressure a bit. Niagara Falls and romance.
By moonlight round the island, and just as I began to be weary with the length of the way, a young married couple who had come to pay true homage to nature by consecrating their new happiness at this shrine commenced singing. Their voices mingling with and softening the roar of the falls floated richly on the air. The magnificence of the falls speaks of more than just its sheer raw power. Its beauty touches our imagination and brings to life the poet, the dreamer, the romantic in us. To many, the falls sing a song of love and become a special place to share that special feeling. Niagara Falls has long been one of America's favorite honeymoon havens. It was Joseph Alston and his bride, Theodosia Burr Alston, who made the first honeymoon visit. She was the daughter of Vice President Aaron Burr. It was in June of 1801 that the couple journeyed through the wilderness of New York State on their way to visit Mohawk Indian Chief Joseph Brant. Little did they know that they'd become the first pair in a long procession of lovers to visit the falls. But the real trendsetters were Napoleon Bonaparte's brother Jerome and his bride. Jerome married into the wealthy Patterson family from Baltimore, Maryland, and as expected, they took the summer months of 1803 to celebrate. Their trip took them up to Boston, across to Lake Ontario and Niagara Falls, and then back to Baltimore. High society took note of their elaborate travels, and visiting the falls became a popular thing to do. The real key to the development of the falls as a love nest came with the growth of transportation. Without a way to get here, a couple were literally all dressed up with no place to go. With the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, it made it possible to come up the Hudson to Albany and across the state. When the railroads evolved, people took advantage of excursion trains. In 1850, New York Central began lines between Niagara Falls and New York City. And by the late 1800s, the railroad traffic increased with close to 100 trains in and out of Niagara Falls every day. An overnight train trip could bring you right to the brink of excitement. The hotspot to honeymoon was the Cataract House International Hotel. Its growth coincided with that of transportation. Between 1825 till it burned down in 1945, the Cataract House was the mecca for honeymooners. Double rooms on the riverside with a veranda and parlor were $10 a day, or $1.50 if you weren't choosy about the room. The Niagara Falls Historical Society is in possession of the Cataract House registrars, which contain the names of many famous honeymooners who shared a view never to be forgotten. Remember, people were still paying 25 cents a piece to see the falls up until July 15th of 1885. Now we just spent a quarter for a closer view. Well, with the price of their transportation, their room, admission to see the falls, a honeymoon trip could be a pretty expensive proposition, reserved mostly for the well-to-do. Word of this national attraction began spreading far and wide. From the south, plantation owners often traveled north for the summer, bringing along their slaves. And the wealthy from the eastern seaboard escaped the summer heat by slipping away to Niagara Falls. They were soon joined by European socialites who enjoyed strolling among the sights, exploring the gorge, chatting on the verandas, and dining out. Most of the major hotels had dining rooms for their guests, but it was considered a novelty to go to one of Niagara Falls' newly opened restaurants. And there were several man-made attractions that also contributed to the widespread talk about this honeymoon haven. The year 1829 saw the construction of the Biddle Staircase down the face of Goat Island. A set of 90 stairs wound spirally down an 80-foot tower and provided a breathtaking view of the American Cascade. And a walkway was built from Goat Island onto the crest of the Horseshoe Falls. You literally were able to look down into the thundering waters below. In 1833, an addition was built onto the walkway. A crude round tower about 30 feet high and 12 feet wide contained a staircase leading to a viewing balcony near the top. Views from the balcony were said to be among Niagara's best. An early promotional booklet noted the 22-mile trek aboard the Niagara Central's Beltline trip was a very important and delightful thing to do. Trains departed every 15 minutes, and for $1, the electric cars ventured on both sides of the river. Perhaps the most well-known attraction, still in operation today, is the renowned Maid of the Mist. The maiden voyage happened in 1843 aboard a sturdy side-wheeler with twin smokestacks. The fee? Only 18 cents. As you stand and look northerly from Terrapin Point, you can see the Rainbow Bridge. Well, back in 1897, near that site, the Falls View Bridge stood. It quickly became known as the Honeymoon Bridge because of all the lovers strolling back and forth. That span stood till 1938, when an ice jam caused it to collapse. 4 years later, in 1942, the Rainbow Bridge was built to replace it. Another attraction back in the 1800s was the Lower Suspension Bridge. At the time it was built, Niagara Falls could boast it was the home to the largest bridge in the world. And then Niagara Falls can boast what may be the shortest honeymoon on record. It seems that a New Jersey aviator home on leave whisked his bride into his plane, flew up here, circled the gorge, zipped under the honeymoon bridge, and then turned around and went home. We don't know how long that marriage lasted, but one thing is for certain. Niagara Falls has been an inspiration to millions of people who've traveled near and far to be touched by its beauty. The artists, the poets, the lovers who stroll arm in arm all tell us that the falls indeed cast a romantic spell. News Center 2 photographer Andy DeSantis has put that feeling into pictures. The Attawandaronk and then the Seneca Indians moved without restrictions through this area, a right they still retain today. But with the white man came disagreements. Through the years, there have been people who were so moved by the powerful natural wonder that they were determined to protect it. They often clashed with people who wanted to use Niagara for its physical power. The French first put up a sawmill on the rapids in the mid-1700s. The British improved the mill in the second half of the century. The sawmill was used back then to make timbers for military forts. And during the War of 1812, those wooden barriers came into play, with the British and American forces pushing each other back and forth in skirmishes. After the war, Niagara's big draw was tourism, and the Canadians and Americans have been able to work closely in the 20th century to make the most of Niagara. Susan? Thanks, Roxanne. You know, there's another part of Niagara Falls history we haven't talked about yet. People have done some of the craziest things here, and who better to tell us about them than our own crazy man, Barry Lillis.
Back in the 50s, I was a youngster working on the Maid of the Mist boat ride. Boy, it was a lot of fun, too. Yeah, I was the guy who put on the rain slickers on the people, you know, and I also did the narrative where you tell how high the falls were and all sorts of fascinating facts like that. But I think one of the most interesting parts of the job is to watch the expression on people's faces when they would stare up at the falls in awe. Yes, indeed. But one day, that quiet awe changed to shrieks and cries of, "Hey, there he is! He's disappeared! Can you see him?" It was August 5th, 1951. Canadian Red Hill Jr. took a flimsy vessel made up of 13 inner tubes, held together by fishnet and canvas, and entered the water above Niagara Falls. Because of the lack of weight, the airy vessel was battered about between the rocks and bounced up and down the air like a balloon in a parade. Onlookers knew even before the inner tube barrel reached the crest that the breaking up vehicle, well, they knew it was disintegrating. And what you see here is a picture of Red Hill's vessel of death, which Hill laughingly called the Thing. Hill's body was retrieved nude and battered the next day. I got to tell you, as an eyewitness to that event back in the early 50s, I must tell you, it held me spellbound, as it did everybody else that saw it. Matter of fact, this whole thing about daredevils holds people in kind of a quiet disbelief. When you think about it, here a human being voluntarily electing to do so, being that far away from death and knowing it. Well, the whole thing started back in the early 1800s. But let's not go back that far yet. Instead, let's go back to a year ago, to an event that you may remember reading in your paper or seeing on your television set. It was the saga of Karl Suchek. Karl Suchek, a Hamilton, Ontario stuntman that was hell-bent on defying the mighty Niagara and the local authorities, too. He beat the falls, then paid his fine July 2nd of last year. After beating the falls, fate, however, ran out on Suchek. While in Houston, Texas, Suchek tried to show a cheering crowd an assimilation of his Niagara deed as they dropped Suchek inside a barrel into a large bucket of water. Well, something went wrong. Suchek hit the side of the receiving container, and in a roundabout fashion, it was another score for the mighty Niagara. Well, this thing had to start with somebody and somewhere, and it did, with Sam Patch over by Goat Island. Now, here's what Sam did. He mounted scaffolding up in the air about 100 feet off the water, see? And then he'd climb up the scaffold, and then he'd dive into the water, hitting it about 60 miles an hour. Well, the people loved it. I mean, he was dynamite. They really applaud old Sam. The only problem is nobody wanted to come up with any donations, no money. Well, Sam got miffed. So he took his act to the Genesee River. He thought the folks down there might be easier pickings, you see. So he mounted his scaffold, jumped in the Genesee River, and he got killed. He died. So ends the saga of Sam Patch. Well, things kept quiet for many, many years after that, until along came a fellow by the name of Blondin. A Frenchman, Jean-Francois Gravelet, or stage name, the Great Blondin. In 1859, if it had anything to do with tightrope walking over the gorge, Blondin, he could do it. He walked forward, he walked backward, he stood on his head, he chained his arms and legs, he jumped somersaults, he carried a stove to the center and fried himself an egg. He even carried his manager across from the United States to Canada. At the Tussauds Museum in Niagara Falls, Ontario, they have Blondin memorabilia, like this wheelbarrow that he pushed across the gorge, and this bicycle he rode across the gorge on. That was 125 years ago. Just outside the Tussauds Museum on the Clifton Hill Strip in Niagara Falls, Ontario. There he is. Or at least in a manner of speaking, Blondin, walking the tightrope again to the stare of the crowds, as he did 125 years ago. But how did Blondin end up? Well, you're probably looking for a bizarre tale about his death, huh? Sure. Sorry, he died in England, in bed, at the age of 73. But he did become rich, and he was one of the few who did. Well, as the news of the exploits of Blondin and the money he was making became widely known, well, out came the imitators, frankly. And there was one who decided there was really gold in them there tightropes. That one was the great Farini. Farini. Would you get more excited about, say, watching a fellow by the name of Signor Guillermo Antonio Farini doing the death-defying stunt of walking the gorge on that thin piece of rope? Sure, that'd be pretty exciting. Well, it'd be more exciting than watching a fellow by the name of Bill Hunt do it, huh? Bill Hunt knew that. So Bill Hunt became Signor Guillermo Antonio Farini, and he traveled all the way from Lockport, New York, to do it, too. Oh, there were many others. There was Leslie, who just walked the tightrope. A Signor Bellini, who bounced himself up and down on a rubber rope. Steve Peer, what a guy. He got high marks for daring do, but low marks for not being too bright, frankly. He walked the tightrope in his street shoes in the dark of night. They found him the next day. Sam Dixon, a Toronto photographer, was so great that many said that he outdid the stunts of Blondin. And the people responded to his courage to the tune of a whole $56 and some change. Now, the only woman to walk a tightrope was Maria Spalterini, a 23-year-old lady who made it look so easy, the audience just kind of yawned and walked away. So her public relations guy told her, he said, Maria, put on some peach baskets on your feet and a sack over your head. Then do it. Well, it worked. One of the most bizarre stunners was a ship's captain, his name, Joel Robinson. In June of 1861, on a $500 bet, Robinson took the Maid of the Mist and turned it away from its reasonably safe direction of the pools near the falls and headed it down towards the turbulent rapids. Several times it looked like the end of the Maid and its wild captain. But as severely battered as the craft was, later, she's still tied up at the moorings near Queenston. And that's a feat never again duplicated. Just about the end of the 1800s, people kind of got tired of the leapers and the tightrope walkers and the gorge swimmers. Frankly, it became old hat. They were looking for something new to ooh and ah about. For that, we came to the Daredevil Hall of Fame at the Niagara Falls, Ontario Museum. And for the new idea, frankly, we had to leave it to the ladies. Or this lady, anyways. Her name was Annie Edson Taylor. She was a school marm from Michigan. On October 24th, 1901. Well, Annie got in this barrel. They cushioned it with pillows. She went over the falls, and she lived. Sure, she was beat up from the venture, but she endured and became the first woman, the first person, ever to go over the falls in a barrel. Well, this extraordinary feat by Annie Edson Taylor going over the falls in a barrel really stimulated a lot of excitement among stunt people, huh? Especially this guy, Bobby Leach. And this is the actual barrel that Bobby used to go over the falls. And there's Bobby standing next to the barrel. The year he went over, 1911. Yep, Bobby went over all right, but he broke his leg and he got some head injuries. But he was so elated at surviving, he didn't much care. And he knew how to merchandise. He was on one big continuous world tour, and being a great talker, he was able to thrill the audiences. Well, the mighty Niagara couldn't do old Bobby Leach in. But this did. See, here's what happened. As we mentioned before, he was very successful on these speaking tours, you see, and he was on a speaking tour in 1926 in a place called Christchurch, New Zealand. Well, he was taking a walk one day, and some careless individual was eating an orange and throwing the orange peels down. This is a true story. He come across one of the orange peels, up in the air, bam, he broke his leg, gangrene set in, and that's the end of the tale of Bobby Leach. Oh, this contraption here belonged to Jean LeCire. 1928, just 2 years after Bobby Leach's death, LeCire went over the falls in this rubber ball. What it was hard rubber tied together by these metal strands, and it had inner tubes inside for cushioning purposes, you see. Jean LeCire afterward proclaimed the excursion, you might say in today's language, he called it a piece of cake. Now, Jean also had an eye for a fast buck. So he sold strips of inner tube from his ball to excited tourists at 50 cents a strip. That Jean LeCire was quite a guy, funny guy. You see, many years later, somebody addressed him on. They said, hey, Jean, now, for years, you've been selling those rubber strip souvenirs off that ball that you went over the falls in. How were you able to do that? How come you never ran out? Well, Gene's reply certainly shocked some and startled many when he was very candid, and he told them, he said, My never-ending supply came from your friendly neighborhood gas station. Oh, there were many others. Well, like in 1930, there was a chap by the name of Stahatkis. He was a Greek chef in Buffalo. He had a 2,200-pound barrel, see, real heavy barrel. The thing got wedged behind the falls. He had enough oxygen for 3 hours. They pulled him out about a day later, and, well, he was dead, obviously. How about this one? One fella tied a 100-pound anvil to his legs, you see, to give him push going over the falls. It gave him push, all right. The anvil went right through the bottom of the barrel at the brink of the falls, taking the guy with him. They never found him, and back to the drawing board on that one. But no circumstances were stranger than the ones surrounding this man. William Fitzgerald was his real name. He was known as Nathan Boya. With no fanfare, on July 15, 1961, Boya went over the falls in a rubber-covered steel ball. He paid $5,000 to build it. He paid $113 in fines to the court, and he refused to accept any ideas for money-making schemes, and he shunned the news reporters. After the event, he returned to New York City and obscurity. Now, why did he do it? To this day, nobody knows. You know, I guess we can all understand how a football player can get all excited at the thrill of a touchdown, or a mountain climber climbing peaks that no one else has ever climbed before. That would be rather exciting. But what would motivate a man or a woman to do a stunt that would take them so close to certain death? In 1978, Philip Petit of New York City asked local authorities for permission to walk across the brink of the falls on a tightrope. Remember, many have walked across the gorge, but no one has ever walked across the falls. So we spoke to Philip Petit in New York City and asked simply, why?
I was for 20 years dreaming of putting a high wire above both falls, which was never done, of course, and which was never thought of before. Because nobody ever walked over the falls on a tightrope, but everyone, starting with a countryman Blondin in 1859, walked above the Niagara Rapids, which is miles away from the falls. So, after dreaming of that for years, I arrived in America and I did the performance, you know, between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, and was catapulted to the front pages and to the talk shows where, again, I said my main dream as a wire walker will be to use that fabulous natural theater that are Niagara Falls.
I guess it has to do with winning. The stakes are so high, a life, eh? By the way, as you're watching this show and you're saying to yourself, maybe the prospects are becoming rather attractive to get rich quick, huh? You might want to stop thinking along those lines. Come on, I want to take you across town. And this is a graveyard in Niagara Falls, New York. And this particular section was known at that time as Stranger's Rest. And I guess you can kind of figure out what that means. And here lies Captain Matthew Webb. In 1875, he became the first person to swim the English Channel. And that's an impressive feat even today. But in 1883, the good captain decided to try his luck on swimming the swirling rapids down the river from the falls. And, well, they found his body 4 days later. Oh, this old Carlisle Graham. Back in the 1800s, old Carlisle excited the folks. 5 times he shot the rapids with his barrel. He make any money? Well, he's here. Annie Edson Taylor. You remember Annie Edson Taylor from early part of our story? Annie is the first one ever to go over the falls in a barrel. And no one will deny that this lady had courage. But unfortunately, when it came to the stage, she bombed. You see, she went out with a vaudeville troupe and put people to sleep. So she bombed and returned back to Niagara Falls to sell penny postcards of herself and little pamphlets explaining the harrowing experience that she had in 1901. Yeah, life didn't go too well. She died in 1926, broke. She didn't even have the $3 it took to bury her. Others had to do it, you see. Yep. Final days were not all good for you, were they, Annie? No. But I'll tell you, there is one thing you took with you. One thing nobody else has. Because, you see, when it comes to barrels, and this is written in history, when it comes to barrels, you were the first person The first woman, the first ever, to beat the mighty Niagara.
The world has lost a lot of its innocence in the 20th century. We have tamed the atom, we've walked on the moon, and hydropower seems pretty tame also. But Niagara Falls has a lot of force, and it can produce a lot of juice. Since 1896, 5 big power plants have been built here.
First generators that were installed alongside of the water wheels, which were then as turning flour wheels, or turning wheels to generate power for flour mills. These were DC, direct current generators. It was soon determined that they could not send direct current any great distances. Interestingly, it was at those years that the telegraph system started, and there was a line between Buffalo and Niagara Falls, and the operators at night, when times were slow, got to experimenting, and the operator in Niagara Falls, he had the direct current to run his generator, but the operator in Buffalo had the bicycle type generator that he had to pedal. And obviously he didn't enjoy doing that, and these two operators experimented, and they sent current from Niagara Falls to Buffalo, which operated the Buffalo generator, and that really was the first electricity transported any distance. So
it was in 1901 that President McKinley highlighted the new age of science. Electricity from Niagara Falls was fueling the lights at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, as well as the city's industries. And over the years, it has been the lure of cheap hydropower from Niagara that has brought jobs to western New York.
The power that generated in Niagara Falls, which was in huge amounts, was consumed entirely in the city of Niagara Falls by the electrical chemical industry, which developed at the time of the First World War, when we lost our ability to get chemicals from Germany. These plants are still there, such as DuPont, Hooker, Union Carbide, etc.
Officials from the State Power Authority are still making improvements to the latest plant built in 1963. And hydropower is still being used to try to entice new jobs here. Governor Cuomo just used that angle with General Motors, hoping to woo the new Saturn plant to our area. We'll be back.
Great Lakes out of the Earth's crust some 50,000 years ago. That big ice pack melted about 12,000 years ago. Since then, the water surging from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario has been eating away at the rock cliffs separating them, creating the Niagara River Gorge. That erosion goes on year after year, some 2 to 3 feet of land lost each year. And at times, that's created problems for modern-day sightseers, like on a hot July day 2 years ago. Dick Lisinski was watching as crews carefully blasted away the loose rock from Terrapin Point.
The day of the scheduled big blast dawned bright and sunny. The prospect of watching history being made as all that rock gets blown into the gorge drew a larger than usual crowd to Prospect Point. Local and national news media were on hand to record the big event, everyone expecting it to happen at about 8 a.m. But as often happens with projects of this scope, there were a few last-minute snags.
10 o'clock, folks. Been canceled again. Well, the delay is caused by the bad weather conditions out on the point. It's very windy, very wet. They're working with very lightweight plastic tubing, and it's just difficult to handle under those conditions.
Finally, just after noon, more than 4 hours after the scheduled time, part of Terrapin Point became a memory. Getting rid of the unstable rock not only allowed tourists to get onto the point, it cleared the lines of sight into the gorge, prompting one parks official to comment, "The project cost us $300,000, but it gave us a $1 million view."
That was in 1983. Many years before that, another wild spectacle, when the Honeymoon Bridge came tumbling down.
Photographers from all the leading news services descended on Niagara Falls, ready to take the bridge falling into the gorge. It was during the winter and bitterly cold, and one afternoon they all decided that they would retreat to the local pub to warm up. One of the photographers left a little boy holding the key to his camera. His pictures show the bridge starting to fall, but of course the little boy could not turn the camera down. The scenes we have today for history were taken by Frank Seed, a local photographer who had all the warm clothes, built a little fire, and had a wife who fed him during the time that he kept up his vigil, which lasted 1 week. His pictures were shown all over the world. A friend was beseeched by his wife to go and see the bridge for the last time. And he was not very patient with his wife, but finally gave in and drove up, opened the door of the car, and said, "There, I told you the bridge was still in position." And as they looked in horror, the bridge fell into the gorge.
Coming up next, Barry tells us about some big doings above the falls.
WGRZ TV helped to kick off the centennial celebration with the second annual concert in the sky. It was right here, right over Niagara Falls. What a great way to celebrate a birthday, but with fireworks. Set the music. This beautiful symphony of sight and sound drew over 125,000 people. TV2 once again commissioned Paul Austin of Wichita, Kansas, to orchestrate this pyrotechnic extravaganza over one of the natural wonders of the world. TV2's original soundtrack was fed to scores of state-of-the-art public address sound systems throughout the park, while WBUF FM 93 broadcast it simultaneously for those who wish to hear it on stereo radio. About 10:05 p.m., the sky was a perfect background for Paul's wizardry. The crowd was anxious to hear the first sounds of music and fireworks rock the gorge. Here is a portion of the 25-minute show that TV2 presented that night.
I can feel no sense of measure, no illusions as we take refuge in young man's pleasure, breaking down the dreams we make real.
Thanks for joining us as we celebrated the first 100 years of the Niagara Reservation.
And look forward to its future.
Good night.